I went to Whole Foods to get their $1 oyster, and I want to tell you everything, the good, the bad, and some of the secrets I learned from people that used to work there. Now, if you didn't know, on Fridays, $1 oysters are a thing at Whole Foods. At my local Whole Foods in Annapolis, Maryland, these were the varieties they had, and while it says $1.39 to $1.49 on there, when I checked out, they came out to $1 a piece, and that is a great deal for oysters. So the first one I'm going to try is this wild Wellfleet oyster. Now, I've had Wellfleet oysters before, and I actually like them a lot. They're like a high 8 to me if I'm rating them from 1 to 10, and normally where I get them from, they're pretty fresh, and you can just tell they got a nice, crisp, sweet, kind of briny taste to them with a little bit of umami. So in my head, I got a pretty good idea of what this should taste like compared to the ones that I've had before. Now, my biggest fear of these $1 oysters is that they're $1 for a reason. My guess is they get these earlier in the week and they just aren't super fresh. Now, after tasting this one, it still tasted pretty fresh. It wasn't as good as the ones I've had before that were farm direct, but despite being $1, they were still a good, solid oyster. The next oyster I tried was from the Kou Oyster Company in Massachusetts, and this one had some high hopes because it looked really fresh. It looked like it was one of the newer oysters, and I'm kind of wondering if they put a new stock out there of these because I've heard they're really good and I heard they're really popular. Now, I found all these oysters to shuck really easily. They were nice and tightly closed. Getting the knife in the hinge really wasn't a problem too much, not much shelf liking at all. And once I got the knife in there, it was easy just to turn that door handle like that and really cut that adductor muscle and open them up. And I was correct. This looked like a really nice, fresh oyster. Look how beautiful and plump this thing is. This is exactly what you want an oyster to look like before you slurp it down. Now, like I said, this is the first time I've ever tried a Kou oyster from Massachusetts, so I got it all ready to slurp down, cut the adductor muscle, no anything on it, no hot sauce, lemon, lime, anything like that, and I gave it a taste, and guys, this thing was good. This was a good representation of a Massachusetts oyster. I'm going to say this is like a high 9s for me. This was a delicious, delicious oyster. And if you see them in Whole Foods, definitely go ahead and get yourself some. That. Now, this is where the oyster taste testing took a little turn for the worse. These are Blue Point oysters, and a lot of people rave about them, but I've heard in recent years the quality has started to go down. So couple that with it being a $1 oyster, I definitely had my suspicions about trying this one out. Now, the oyster seemed tightly closed, which is a great sign. It shucked pretty easily because I was able to get the knife right on the hinge there, but when I opened it up, I could tell right away there was something wrong with this oyster. It looked dried out, kind of gross, and there was pea crabs in it, which normally isn't a bad sign, but I don't know if the pea crab itself, which is a parasite to the oyster, made it so this oyster is really anemic looking, or if the age of the oyster itself made it so this oyster just looked absolutely terrible. But I'm not going to eat this one. And a little side note, if you do get pea crabs in your oysters, it is okay. So pea crabs and oysters are completely normal, and they're actually a parasite for oysters and not a parasite for humans. I will say the better sign though is when the pea crab is still alive inside the oyster. I think the fact that the pea crabs are dead inside these oysters kind of proves my point. These are definitely older oysters, probably about a week out from when they were harvested on the farms, and it just makes it so it's not a fresh product. And honestly, this Blue Point oyster, this is the first one that could really taste the difference. It didn't taste rotten or anything like that. It just was flat. You couldn't taste the brininess, you couldn't taste the sweetness, and you couldn't taste the umami. This one was like a mid 5s to a low 5s, kind of 4 score for me. Like, I didn't like this one at all. But when I made a short video about this oyster, someone sent me a message that used to work at Whole Foods and said the Blue Point oysters have been going through some problems lately. But also, if you go on a Friday, ask for the fresh stock. Ask for the ones that came in first because they're told to sell the old ones first, but you can still get some of those fresh ones too. Now, the last oyster I tried is a Standish oyster. It had a different appearance than a lot of the other oysters I've tried. It was a lot more flat and wide, and there wasn't a deep cup to it. I really like a deep cup in an oyster because then it can hold some of that oyster liquor, which holds a little bit more flavor and a little bit more of that kind of oyster essence that you love when you're eating raw oysters. Now, again, this one shucked really easily. I didn't have any concerns so far about it being fresh or not fresh. When I opened it up, I could tell this actually looked like a pretty fresh oyster. It was nice and plump, took up most of the shell. And to be honest, I had pretty high hopes for this oyster because it did look really good. But as soon as I put it in my mouth and gave it a chew, I could tell like this oyster was one of those ones that was older too. It just was flat. It didn't have all the umami and all the sweetness. It still was a solid oyster, but not exactly what I like in my oysters. So my plan on the next video is go try out this guy's tips of how to get the freshest oysters from Whole Foods. And I'll be sure to take everyone along for the journey from the time I walk in to the time I order those oysters to the time I try them back at my house.